Hi, I'm Nancy Linruth with unblockresults.com, and I want to talk a bit about how EFT works. This is one of the most common questions I'm asked about EFT or tapping, as I usually talk about it. How does it work? Well, for a long time, I had basically a twofold answer. First of all, I would say they don't really know how it works, and I don't care as long as it actually does work. So I knew from my own experience with clients that the EFT tapping works. And I also could point to a number of research studies out there showing that EFT is effective. And that number has only expanded since then because there's just been a ton of research done on EFT showing that it is at least as effective as what's considered the gold standard of therapy approaches, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. I got to tell you, usually those studies show that EFT is actually more effective than CBT. That means there are less symptoms of the problem, uh, or maybe sometimes it goes the problem is no longer there at all. It's no longer diagnosable. Sometimes the symptoms are still there, but it's subclinical, so you wouldn't get diagnosed with it. Sometimes you still get the diagnosis, but there's less symptoms of it. Uh, but however you look at it, tapping does reduce those symptoms a bit or a lot. And it does that in fewer sessions than CBT does. But it takes longer. On top of that, the effects of tapping are long lasting. So CBT is good, it's effective. I'm not saying don't use it. It's actually quite good, but the research shows that tapping is at least as good as it, sometimes better. Now, most of those old studies were about phobias. Started with phobias. Phobias are easy to track. How close can you get to the tarantula in the cage, or how long can you stand there in an enclosed place? So they started with phobias. They also pretty quickly got into PTSD, and I hazard a guess that most of the studies that are available were done on PTSD. Also, you can measure it, but probably more importantly, this is an area that we just so desperately needed more and more effective therapies for. And EFT works with PTSD. I knew that from my therapy practice back when I was doing therapy. It works, and so the studies are there now, really showing it to the effect that a few years ago, Kaiser Permanente, one of the biggest in insurance companies in at least in the U.S., was allowing EFT to be used with their insureds, um, and the VA was allowing EFT to be used with the vets. Those are signs, like the VA is really tight on what is allowed and is not allowed to be used in forms of therapy. So the fact that both of those entities were saying, okay, it's okay to use EFT, was a big sign that the research was there supporting it. Okay, so you have the research to support it. So and my experience was that it worked. So I'm like, I'm just going to use it. But then I would go on, my second answer to the how does EFT work would be to say, well, here's my best guess. At that time, there were studies out there showing that acupuncture, the needles on these acupressure points, if you use acupuncture on certain points, it would send a message of safety and calm to the amygdala, in effect. Um, Now, then there was another study or two that showed if you tapped or rubbed these same acupressure points, acupoints, I believe they're referred to, tapping or rubbing them gives the same effect as the needles. Same safety and calm to the mid part of the brain. So then I would put those two studies together and I would say that tapping tells the amygdala to just chill out. And by doing that, it disconnects the trigger and the response. So if you have a phobia of spiders, and you you see a picture of a spider, your response would be fear. physically, emotionally. So when you tap, you break up that connection, and then you could have the trigger, but you don't get the response anymore. And that trigger response doesn't reconnect without some other experience. If you never have another experience with a spider, it isn't going to reconnect. You can see pictures of spiders, you can see them crawling on your wall, and it's not going to bug you. Now, I didn't have any research for that last part to point to, that the trigger response wouldn't reconnect. It was just based on observation that those results lasted. Now, that's what I would do. Look, I don't know, no one knows how it works. I just does, so I use it, but here's my best guess. Well, the science has since advanced. I was hearing the other week from a talk from somebody who I respect, who is PhD in psychology and has been studying tapping. Excuse me. And he was sort of updating us all on where the research lies now. And it has gotten further along. So here's what he was saying. First of all, science shows us, the research shows us that tapping leads to the downregulation of the amygdala. That's basically the same thing as saying it sends the message of safety and calm to the amygdala and tells it to chill out. But it sounds so much more scientific to say there's the downregulation of the amygdala. So tapping downregulates the amygdala. And there's some really very interesting research on this, and I geek out on that, so I'll just share it a little bit with you here. There's a certain research study that was done that showed that tapping led to lowered levels of cortisol. If you've heard of cortisol before, it's often called the stress hormone. So when you get stressed out, your cortisol levels go up, and you can be stressed out from too much work. But you can also be stressed out from that picture of the spider if you've got a phobia, for example. Okay, so anyway, this one study that I'm referring to was done by a guy named Dawson Church. And I was at a training where he was talking about that study and how he set it up. He did a saliva test of all of his subjects before that. They then did some tapping, and then he did a saliva test after they did the tapping. And then he was going to compare the before and after lab results for cortisol in their saliva test. Okay. He sent them off to the lab, and he was planning to use the results that were coming back in a talk he was going to give to I think he was giving to doctors about tapping. And it usually took, if I'm remembering this correctly, it takes a couple of weeks to get your results back from that lab. And 2 weeks went by, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and he was getting a little stressed out because his talk was coming up. So finally, he picks up the phone and he calls the head of the lab, and asks, what's going on with my results? I've been waiting and waiting. So when he found out what had happened was that the person who was in charge of doing the results on the tests that he'd sent in, the saliva tests, that person had seen the results and said, this can't be. It's not possible. Cortisol's just, the levels never drop that much, that quickly. It just doesn't happen. He didn't trust what he was seeing. Maybe it was a she. I don't know. They didn't trust it. They went and ran it again. And I think they ran it again because it kept coming up in a way that did not make sense to the person in the lab. Well, finally, Dawson gets his results, and yes, indeed, they showed those cortisol levels dropped way down, and they did it very, very quickly. So he was able to use that with his talks. Very interesting for us is that other folks have done that same study again since Dawson did it in the first place, and they've come back with the same results. In fact, I think they've come back with results showing that those cortisol levels dropped even more than they had dropped in that first study. I don't know why, but at least they came down at least as much and more. That was far beyond any other technique to bring down cortisol levels. Pretty fascinating stuff. So yes, the amygdala is downregulated. There's less cortisol in the system. All that good stuff showing that tapping lowers the stress response. But why is it that these effects continue after you stop tapping and it doesn't come back? You don't see the picture of the spider 4 weeks later and go right back to the old way of reacting to it. It's just like, oh yeah, that's just a picture of a spider. I'm not upset by that. Well, the new bit of research that we can talk about here is really research around memory reconsolidation. Um, and I'll see if I can explain this in the right way. Um, they used to think of a memory, as like a file that's in a file drawer. So if you want to look at that memory, you open the file drawer, you pull out your file of that memory, you open it up, you read through the file, close it up again, put it back in the file drawer, unchanged, close the file drawer. That's just the memory. That's where it's stored. It doesn't change in that picture of it. Well, two things about that. First of all, memories do change, and we know that. We've known that for a while. There's some research that was done with a group of World War II vets right after they came out of the war, I believe, and they were interviewed about something that had happened. And then I think several decades later, they came back to those vets and asked them about the same thing. And their stories of what had happened to them in the war had changed somewhat significantly, actually. It wasn't just a little tiny bit, but, the memories had shifted. And that's pretty normal. But I'm not talking about normal memories. It's interesting that this was World War II vets, because what the memories that don't change that way are actually traumatic memories. So I must assume that those memories were not necessarily about a traumatic event, a bomb going off or whatever in the war. Perhaps it was simply about, what was it like in the mess hall or something like that. Because when you've got a traumatic memory, that is, the metaphor I've heard is that it's encapsulated. It's like a capsule with the memory, with what happened in that capsule, and then you bury it as deep as you can, because you can't keep having that come up, or it come whenever you do open up that memory capsule and look at the memory, it comes in exactly as it happened, including all of the emotions that were there at the time. You feel them all. You relive the event as opposed to just it being a memory. So that kind of memory doesn't change. And I think when they're talking about memory reconsolidation, they're talking about this kind of traumatic memory, because they were saying, memory doesn't change over time. A traumatic memory doesn't change over time, except it can be changed. This is what they've learned with memory reconsolidation. It can be changed if you bring up the memory while having a different experience. Okay, so usually the traumatic memory is relived with the same emotions coming up. It's the same experience. It just stays as is. But if you can bring up that memory while having a different experience, and the research can be around taking a specific kind of medication, a drug, to change your emotional and physical reaction. That's one way to change it. There's a way to do it with talk therapy. That was the first thing I've ever heard about. I read a little blurb in a magazine, therapy magazine, which was mind-blowing to me, because that's something that should be known. They were doing a specific way of having the person, call up a memory while they'd already found a different way to think about it. So that was pretty cool. But for me, the main way to change that experience when you call up a traumatic memory was to be tapping while you called it up. Because you tap, you send the message of safety and calm, you down-regulate the amygdala, which would ordinarily get triggered with that traumatic capsule memory. But you down-regulate it now, and that allows that memory to change. You experience, instead of the trauma of it, the fear and the all the rest that goes with the traumatic experience. Instead, you experience, oh, I'm okay, I'm safe. And that memory then becomes reconsolidated in a different way. Now, when you call it up, you no longer relive it. It's like it went back in the file. It's just a memory that you can look at from the outside. So if a memory's emotional component changes this way before it gets put back in the file drawer, the next time it gets pulled out, it's going to be the new version, not the encapsulated version that comes up with all the attending trauma with it. That's why tapping on a memory leads to these long-lasting changes. It explains that long-lasting result that you can get with tapping on PTSD and phobias. Often phobias come from an experience. PTSD is by definition, it comes from an experience of being afraid for your life or your physical integrity, or seeing somebody else with fear for them. Phobias quite often come from an experience. Step on a snake in the woods that's a rattler, and you like. I've heard some real doozy stories, but tapping on that memory can change the experience, and then the phobia no longer gets triggered. It's just not there anymore. All right, so this downregulating the amygdala and memory reconsolidation explains why phobias and PTSD can lose they can lose their oomph. But it still doesn't explain why the tapping that I do with my clients works. So what I do is I release subconscious rules and beliefs. Many of those come from childhood, but they're often not coming from a traumatic event. Let me give you an example to show you how this works. Let's say someone grew up in a family where money was tight. That this often leads to a money ceiling being developed. They're only allowed so much money in their life, no more. And it's usually an amount of money that has them feel about the way they did when they were growing up, and hearing mom talking about, oh, there's not enough money for that, or not being able to get some toy that they want, or whatever it was. They have internalized a belief around how much money is acceptable to them, how much they're allowed to have as being a member of the family. And it's subconscious. I mean, you do this when you're 4 years old. You're not going to be thinking about it again when you're 30, but it's still running the show. It develops this money ceiling, which means it's an upper limit on how much money you can bring in or keep. And you have a money ceiling if, well, there's a few different ways you could see it. It could be that you're on a roller coaster. If you make more money than usual one month, then the next 2 or 3 months you make less than usual, sort of balances it out. Or possibly you spend that extra amount as soon as it comes in. Some people have that. It is like the hole in the pocket, it's gone. Or maybe, let's say if you had 2 lines of business, one line makes more, you'll find at the same time the second one's going down somehow. Fascinating stuff. And then sometimes not as dramatically as any of those, but it still can be cooking along, is that you can make the same amount every year, no matter what you do, over and over again. It's sometimes to the penny. It's really fascinating. Anyway, those are how you know that you've got the money ceiling. The money ceiling, though, was put in place not by any particular trauma, usually. It's just these frequent experiences and messages you might have gotten from your family about money. So just, I don't often do direct tapping on specific memories anymore. I sometimes do. Sometimes it's necessary, but usually it's quicker with these subconscious success blocks to get rid of them by tapping in specific different ways that I have, but you tap on the beliefs and rules themselves as opposed to any memories around them directly. So why do these change? And they do. Why can't I raise the money ceiling? Well, my guess is that, for example, the money ceiling, it keeps you from making or keeping more money through some subtle emotions that you're trying to avoid. Okay, if you make more money, you feel a bit uncomfortable with it if it goes over your money ceiling. So you're either going to spend that money right away if it's really uncomfortable, or maybe you'll slow down your marketing, or you'll show up differently in networking events so that you don't bring in as much money for a while after you brought in extra, right? And that balances it out. And that way you don't have to continue to feel uncomfortable. Well, if I have you tapping when you're thinking about having that additional money in your life, you then are going to be changing the emotion you're feeling. Instead of feeling uncomfortable, you're going to be feeling calm and safe, right? And that idea of having more no longer, while you're doing the tapping, isn't triggering that uncomfortable feeling. It's just, hey, I'm fine. I'm not uncomfortable anymore. Why does it last though when we're done? Well, here I'm definitely guessing, but I'm going to guess that there's something like memory reconsolidation around the idea as opposed to around a memory. So if you are feeling more comfortable thinking about having more money, that changes your usual experience with the idea of having more money. That becomes your new normal, and you can keep your money ceiling higher than it was. All right, so that's my best guess. I'm back to saying you don't really know why the tapping I do works, but here's some of the research that maybe supports what's going on here, and this is my best guess. But there is more research on tapping for specifically within the therapy realm. If you're curious about it, hey, reach out. I'd love to talk about it. I geek out about this. I'll tell you, tapping does work on my clients' subconscious success blocks. I don't really know, but I know that it does. If you have some more information on what the science shows around EFT and the subconscious, I would love to hear it. I mean, I try to keep up on what's out there, but I really haven't seen much about that. And I'd love to know what's being done. Well, I hope that was interesting. If you've got any questions, reach out. I would love to talk to you about it. Until I see you again, happy tapping.